there, Bourbon Real Talk listeners and watchers. Randy Sullivan here with a very exciting episode. We are going to go over the entire history of bourbon in the United States. We got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. So we're going to go back before bourbon in the U.S. just for a second. The first reference to whiskey in written history was in 1405 in Ireland, when a clansman was reported to have died from drinking too much at a party, which is kind of ironic. The first reference to corn whiskey, which is the base for bourbon in the United States, in the U.S. was in 1620 when George Sloan wrote a letter, and in it he basically said that they found a way to make a good drink out of the Indian corn, and that he stopped drinking the strong beers from Britain, which were the preferred drink of the day. And that's kind of interesting that whiskey started to supplant the favorite drink even back then. Whiskey in the United States didn't really start to expand until the 18th century. There were a lot of European settlers coming to the United States that were coming from distilling regions that already had a distilling tradition. So you got a lot of people moving in, and then you had the 1776 Revolutionary War, and that had some impacts on U.S. whiskey production. The first of which was it disrupted trade with the Caribbean, and the preferred spirit of the day was rum, and they were unable to get their supply materials from the sugar producers in the U.S., and we were unable to get the rum. And so people started to increase native spirit production, which was whiskey of the time. After the Revolutionary War, settlers started to move out and settle and claim territories for themselves. And as they did this, they were naming things as they went. And this is going to become important in a second. There was an enormous county, right? So we think of counties today as these small, segments of land. But back then, the counties were a lot larger. In fact, some were larger than whole states. And in 1785, the county of Bourbon was established, and it encompassed a lot of Kentucky and Virginia. And it was named after the French royal family. In fact, a lot of things back then were named after the French royal family because Americans were so grateful for the impact that they had in the war with Britain. We probably wouldn't have been able to win without them. And so there was a kind of a sentiment to show honor and respect. And that happened in 1785. Kentucky didn't even become a state until 1792, which is why that bourbon is named 1792. But at the same time, Bourbon Street was a very popular port in New Orleans. And that was also named after the French royal family. So where did the word bourbon come from? Well, this is a hotly disputed topic, and we'll probably never know the true answer. No one really knows for sure. The story that you hear about Elijah Craig, the Baptist minister, and his barn burning, and he made it into barrels, and then he figured out that the char made the whiskey better and all that. That's an old wives' tale. In fact, there's a lot of marketing in bourbon that makes it difficult, if not impossible, to truly know the history of bourbon, because brands have a history and they're kind of notorious for spinning a tale to create some marketing hype to sell a product. And that Elijah Craig story is probably one of them. Although Elijah Craig was a real person, he was a Baptist minister, and he did distill spirits. The origin story of bourbon going through him is probably untrue. What's the most likely explanation for the term bourbon is that people used to put the port of origin on things when they were shipping. And it is highly likely that the port of origin coming from Bourbon County in Kentucky, or the port of origin being Bourbon Street Port in NOLA, was the cause of the spread of the term bourbon in general. All right, so let's talk a little bit about whiskey production in Kentucky itself, the birthplace of bourbon. The first commercial distillery is reported to have opened in 1783, and that was opened by Evan Williams. There's still a brand named after him today. That's actually been disputed. There are some immigration records of some other distillers that we know came here and started producing whiskey that indicated they might have started commercial production production before him. We're not going to know for sure, but he was definitely one of the earliest producers in the late 1700s. In 1794, there was a whiskey rebellion in Pennsylvania. So the newly formed U.S. government starts to try to tax the populace for the first time. And what do they tax? Whiskey. The problem with the tax is that if you were producing whiskey, you had to pay the tax when you produced it and not when you sold it. So there was a cash flow issue, and a lot of people producing whiskey just didn't have the money to pay the tax. They didn't believe that the government should be taxing them. They thought at that time that taxes should come from tariffs in other countries and things like that. And so there was a rebellion, but George Washington, along with the help of his cabinet, squashed that, and that actually led to a lot of those distillers fleeing from Pennsylvania into the relatively wild areas that were further west, and a lot of them landed in Kentucky just simply to avoid the tax, which led to an explosion of bootlegging. So bootlegging has always been a major part of bourbon in the United States, and it's typically either to avoid taxes or to avoid prohibition, which was a period of time that we're going to talk about here in a minute. Now, one of the biggest influencers of bourbon that's kind of the unsung hero, because I don't hear about this a lot, was a couple of brothers that moved to Kentucky from the Cognac region of France. And I may be butchering their name, but I think it's Tarascon brothers. They moved there in 1807, and they established a trade business on the Mississippi River. And their business was basically to buy whiskey from the locals and then ship it down to New Orleans. Why is that significant? Well, they were from the Cognac region where storing spirits in barrels had already become popular, and it was very convenient for shipping. And so it's highly likely that they started to store spirits in barrels before they'd put them on barges to float down to New Orleans. And then when they get there, they'd open up the whiskey and it had developed this brown hue and had a sweeter, more approachable flavor. And everybody started to ask for that whiskey, and it came from Bourbon County. It may be that the port there shipped out from there, and it was, port of origin was Bourbon Street. But regardless, the Tarascon brothers probably increased the use of barrel aging in the corn whiskey that was coming out of Kentucky, and probably played a role in the spread of the word bourbon being associated with that spirit. The oldest known document to create sour mash instructions or document sour mash instructions was from 1818, and it was the Catherine Carpenter of Casey County that had documented sour mash, and that actually had a big impact on the development of bourbon. Sour mash is where you take some of the mash that has fully been spent, meaning the yeast have eaten all of the sugar out of it, and it actually has a higher acidity, and you take a portion of that and put it in your next batch for fermentation. And what that does is it changes the pH level to make it a more suitable environment for the yeast to consume the sugars, but it also helps prevent the spread of bacteria, which was a problem. A lot of people attribute the spread of the sour mash process to James Crowe, and he is the father of modern bourbon, and that's basically because he had a different philosophy. When he started producing his whiskey, he was doing it scientifically, and then he would share those scientific results with other distillers of the day, and he basically helped elevate the entire, production process because of the way that he shared. And he's definitely responsible for the spread of the use of the sour mash process, but he probably was not the inventor. The first advertisement using the word bourbon was in 1821, and that was in the Western Citizen newspaper, and that was from Paris, Kentucky. And the first time that barrels were just labeled as bourbon was in 1840. So in 1840, they stopped using the term Bourbon County whiskey as the port of origin, or Old Bourbon County whiskey, and they just switched to the word bourbon. So at that point, it was officially bourbon, and the word could spread that this was a great liquid that you should be drinking. Some fun facts about bourbon. Well, what a lot of people don't realize is whiskey in general played a much larger role in the growth of the United States, right? And in early America, whiskey was actually a currency. We had a barter economy, and whiskey was a very common way for you to pay for goods and services. But people think of whiskey today as kind of a libation that you drink to relax and to feel the effects of alcohol. But originally, whiskey's production was motivated more by a desire to preserve resources than it was to create a spirit to drink, because you had all of these immigrants coming into the United States and settlers moving west, and they're finding farmland that's great for growing corn, but there's way more corn being grown locally than they can consume, and there was no way to get that corn to the large population centers for it to be consumed before it would rot. And so turning it into a spirit was a great way to preserve that resource. And this is why even Baptist ministers were distillers, right? You had a church, but you also had a farm and you grew corn, and you would convert some of that corn into spirits just so that it would last and you could keep it around as a resource. Another interesting fact from the years 1775, so just before the American Revolutionary War, in 1832, U.S. soldiers were issued 4 ounces of whiskey per day. And if you go and you read about it, it's hilarious. The stuff that George Washington said and other of our founding fathers about the importance of whiskey for soldiers is hilarious when you consider the sentiment towards it today. Another interesting fact, in the 1830s, distilleries started to burn their names into the barrel heads of their barrels. And that is literally where the term brand names come from, because the distilleries were branding their names, and now we use it as this catch-all term, meaning a brand represents something. And then something else that I stumbled across that was interesting, we have commercial refrigeration now, so we are very easily able to find ice, but there was a time frame where you couldn't do that, and there was this guy named Henry David Thoreau who commercialized ice. And originally he was harvesting the ice out of lakes and ponds, but he had developed a packing technique to keep it from melting. He could even ship it down to the Caribbean, and it became very popular, especially in hotter areas, to use ice. And it also caused the spread of cocktails. And I stumbled across this factoid that the first old-fashioned was created in 1886, and it was labeled as that, as an old-fashioned drink. And I thought that was neat. Now back to the history of bourbon. We had the American Civil War, and that had an impact on bourbon spread and production because, first of all, there were a lot of people that would have been involved in whiskey production that were involved in war, right? There were a lot of resources that were destroyed that could have become resources that were going to become whiskey. There was a need to preserve those resources for soldiers, and it slowed whiskey production, and this increased the amount of blended whiskey because blended whiskey can be made very quickly. You don't have to age it as long. You don't have to age it at all. You can make a grain neutral spirit, which is just a clear whiskey base, and you could add colorings and flavorings and things like that. But this also began the downward spiral that led to Prohibition. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. Most whiskey back around the Civil War days were sold in barrels, and they'd be sold to like a drug store or a saloon. And as a consumer, you would bring your own bottles in and you would refill your bottle, because the commercial production of bottles had not really grown to the point where having bottles was affordable. A bottle was a valuable resource, and you wouldn't just recycle it, you would keep it and you would reuse it. But this created an issue because the people that were selling the whiskey, refilling the bottles, had too big of a financial incentive to commit fraud and refill the barrel. And so these bars and druggists, they started refilling their barrel, but they needed to put stuff in it to make it burn. They needed to put stuff in it to make it have color and flavor, and they started poisoning people. And so back then, you had really no idea what you were buying whenever you bought a whiskey. And so people selling bourbon this way were just too tempted to adulterate the product, and it kind of become unsafe. So this led to the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897, which was the first consumer protection legislation passed in the United States. And basically, the Bottled and Bond Act had provisions in it to make sure that there was no tampering with the product between the point that it left the distillery and got into the consumer's hands. And part of that protection was that it had to be sold in bottles that were sealed before they were shipped, so that none of those middlemen would be able to adulterate that product. So from there, we go to World War I, which was from 1914 to 1918. And this also led to the possibility of Prohibition passing. During this time frame, most of the beer in the United States was being produced by German-owned companies. In fact, during this time frame, during a census, 10% of the U.S. population's original language was German. And so this caused kind of an anti-German sentiment once we got involved in the war. And the people promoting Prohibition were using that because they were basically saying, if you're drinking beer, then you're supporting the Germans that are killing our sons and fathers that are overseas fighting for us. It also caused a problem with resources because a lot of the grain that would have been used to create whiskey and bourbon in the United States needed to be diverted for the war effort. So during this time frame, alcoholism was actually rampant in the United States. Alcohol was being used for everything from mood disorders to treatment for all types of illnesses that we know today are not positively affected by alcohol. In fact, back then, U.S. consumption of alcohol was 3 times what it is today. So that causes a problem for society. There was research coming out showing that it increased domestic violence. It had other problems, people not being able to keep jobs, things like that. So the temperance movement is able to latch onto that, along with the fact that alcohol wasn't 100% a known quantity and sometimes was harmful, and they got Prohibition passed. During Prohibition, there were 6 distilleries that were able to operate with medicinal permits. That was Brown-Forman, Frankfurt Distilling, James Thompson & Brothers, American Medical Spirits, Shinley Distilling, and A.P.H. Stitzel Distillery. Bootlegging became universal because Americans didn't stop drinking just because it was illegal, and speakeasies became almost universal. Speakeasies popped up all over the country, and Prohibition actually pushed some of the bourbon distillers out of the United States into other countries. One of the more famous ones was pushed into Mexico, just on the other side of the border, and that becomes significant later when we make bourbon an official American spirit. On December 5th, 1933, Prohibition ended, and that was an issue because there hadn't been any whiskey production with the exception of the medicinal permits, which were basically all being consumed because the population was able to get a lot of permits. And just like today, there were doctors that had businesses that thrived because they'd write permits for people to get the whiskey that they wanted. And there was a huge shortage of whiskey. Anytime there's a shortage of whiskey, you have an increase in the number of blended whiskeys that come out. And that's not always the best. You don't necessarily know what you're drinking. But we kind of worked our way through that by increasing production over the years after Prohibition. And really, the end of Prohibition had more to do with the government being able to secure their taxes, and for the government to also be able to increase consumer protection. So after Prohibition, you're not allowed to buy whiskey in a barrel any longer because of the reasons already mentioned. Everything has to be bottled and sealed. You had revenue agents that were at each distillery that had the keys, and you couldn't get in or out unless they were there, and they were responsible for making sure nothing ever got tampered with, even at the distillery. So along about this time is when the Great Depression hits. The Great Depression started in 1929 and lasted into the mid-1930s. And that actually helped bring an end to Prohibition. The U.S. government was in need of tax revenues, and they needed to get people back to work, and the distillery industry, along with all the distribution jobs and all that stuff, seemed more appealing. And quite honestly, people were not happy, and they needed a drink to relax. And so there was a lot of pressure on the government to end Prohibition, and it did, as mentioned, in 1933. So everything should be peachy keen with bourbon, right? I mean, there's strong demand for bourbon in the US, there's distilleries, everything's growing. Well, hold on just a second. World War II hits. World War II shut down production of bourbon in the United States because the US government needed the US whiskey producers to make neutral spirits because it is a component material in synthetic rubber and gunpowder. And the distilleries were also able to produce penicillin, which was maybe even a bigger contribution to the war effort because most of the people who died in the war weren't necessarily killed by a gunshot wound. A lot of people were dying from infections. So this penicillin that they were able to provide was crucial to the war effort. Now, what's interesting about this is that the U.S. whiskey industry has had all of these disruptions along its history, right? With wars and the Prohibition movement, which was completely avoidable, and then World War II. But during World War II, while we were shut down, Scotland was still able to keep their production up. And basically the way that worked is that the English government needed the tax revenues generated from the production of Scotch because their economy had been devastated. They were within bombing range. And so they were feeding their grains into distilleries at the same time that our grains in the United States are being funneled away from distilleries to provide food for the Allied forces, which would have included the British. And any production that was going on at distilleries was for the war effort. It wasn't for consumable alcohol. And that put us at a major disadvantage because after the war, everybody needed a drink. And so Scotch was able to take over the world market in the eyes of the consumer that were looking for good whiskey. And it took a lot of time for bourbon to recover from that. So that brings us to the time that bourbon becomes an American product. So in 1964, the U.S. Congress passed a concurrent resolution making bourbon a distinctive product of the United States and called for federal regulations to be drawn up that would make sure that only products made in the United States could be sold here if they were labeled bourbon. This had been a long, hard-fought battle. The distillery that had gone to Mexico was a very large and powerful lobbying force at that time, and there's some pretty interesting transcripts of impassioned speeches of people that were paid politicians fighting against the U.S. in favor of some company that's in another country. But despite all of the fighting and back and forth, they finally got it done, and bourbon becomes part of American culture, as American as apple pie. In fact, they should change that saying to as American as bourbon, because that's how American bourbon is. During the 1970s through the 1990s, though, bourbon experienced what I refer to as the bourbon dark ages. And that is when clear spirits came in, marketing started to come in and influence sales in a bigger way as television spread and all of that stuff. And it became more socially acceptable for women to drink, and cocktail culture starts to spread a little bit more, and you start seeing clear spirits coming in and taking over market share and kind of pushing bourbon to the side. And this lasted until the 1990s, when the few distilleries that survived the dark ages, and there weren't very many, were looking for a way to kind of revive the bourbon market. Because bourbon was at a place where, is this kind of going to go by the wayside, or is this going to rebound and become a huge industry like it once was? And luckily, there were some luminaries that some of which are still around today that kind of rebranded bourbon. And what they needed to do was they needed to make the perception of bourbon a premium product. So they created new brands, they could do new marketing, they could do new packaging, and they could do it all at a new price point. And then they started to pit these bourbons kind of against the premium scotches. And bourbon was a relative value compared to Scotch. It was an uphill battle because Scotch has done a very good job at branding itself as kind of the gentleman's drink. And up until this point, bourbon was generally only drank in the South and by certain demographics of people, and so it had kind of a negative connotation in some circles. But through the 2000s, we started to experience the bourbon boom. Really, it started around 2007, 8, 9, maybe as early as 2004. But by 2010, 11, 12, bourbon was really on the uptick. It was drawing in massive quantities of new consumers, for the first time able to penetrate foreign markets. And that was part of what held bourbon back as well, is that bourbon didn't always get favorable tax treatment. It wasn't one of our major exports. So when our politicians are trying to negotiate treaties with other countries, bourbon was way down on the priority list. And so for years and years, Scotland had negotiated favorable treatment for the import taxes of Scotch, while the United States hadn't done that for bourbon. And that also held bourbon back and kept it from growing to the international phenomenon that it is today. So hopefully that is a entertaining and informative short history of bourbon. I have noticed that there's a lot of new people coming to watch the channel, which I'm super grateful for. And I want to tell you about this channel. This channel is about connecting people. It's about bringing people together. I had a younger brother in 2014. He was a military veteran, and unfortunately, he decided to take his own life. And that came as a shock to me and my family, and you never know. There could be people all around you that feel disconnected and separated and unloved. And I wanted to find a way to honor him. I looked into maybe becoming a anti-suicide, prevention speaker, that type of thing. But when I looked into kind of the curriculum that they followed, it wasn't exactly in alignment with my personality. And so I started looking for ways to kind of combat that feeling of alone. And I went to a bottle share, and there were people of all walks of life that didn't even know each other, that were sharing glasses of whiskey, drinking after each other, right? And I realized that there's something special about bourbon. It brings people together. And I also have noticed lately that the world seems very divided along political lines, along, sexual orientation, racial lines. There's all this tension, and I don't see any reason for it. I think that there is a way for us to come together as a people and view each other as, valuable, regardless of political affiliation or sexual orientation or really anything else, right? And so the purpose of this channel is to connect people through bourbon, because I find that if you just sit down and you have a drink with somebody, even somebody that you may disagree with, you can find common ground and you can find a reason to see value and care about that other person. So that's the purpose of this channel. And the way I see it, if a stranger can hate somebody else online that they've never really had a conversation with, it's just as easy for me to love them. And so I am here to tell you that if you woke up this morning and you were unsure whether or not anyone loves you, just know that I love you, and I'll see you next time on Bourbon Real Talk.
This content is being brought to you by the Bourbon Real Talk American Whiskey Aroma Kit. This is a tool that I put together to help all you whiskey aficionados out there develop your palates. You can sit down with the vials and train your senses, or you can sit down with a great dram and break that whiskey down to its components. If you have any interest of purchasing a kit of your own, head on over to bourbonrealtalk.com/shop and pick one up. Thank you for listening.